everyone, welcome to the April 2nd edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and we are looking back at a weekend of racing that included Derby preps, some big performances from around the globe, some very impressive three-year-old efforts this past week, including earlier in the week down in Florida, Gulfstream Park, the weekdays, also on that big Saturday undercard for the Florida Derby, some nice performances even from those not competing in the Derby prep. So a lot to go through on this TimeformUS Pacecast. And Craig, I think we started to get some clarity for this Kentucky Derby picture. And somewhat surprisingly, at least based on the way things were shaping up through the months of February and March, it now seems like we're going to have a clear-cut favorite for this Kentucky Derby and a horse that might be extremely talented.
Yeah, we sure saw that in Fierceness in Florida. I mean, I think we saw some good performances. Of course, one's not going to lead that horse to the Kentucky Derby, but all three preps in their own right had really good winners, in my opinion.
Yeah, we got some big speed figures from this past weekend, something that we had been missing in this three-year-old crop up until this point. Those obviously turned into those Kentucky Derby prep races, but like I was saying, also some other races, some non-stakes events that produced some very fast numbers from this past weekend. So we'll go through all of it. We'll start off by tackling some of those three-year-old stakes races that are going to feed into the Kentucky Derby and the Kentucky Oaks as we start off this podcast. Then we'll move on to talk about the Dubai World Cup, which of course was run on Saturday morning if you're watching from the US. And then we'll talk about all of those other races from Gulfstream Park this past week, those Florida Derby undercard stakes races, as well as that very fast debut victory that I was alluding to earlier in the Florida Derby day card. Couple of other stakes race or non-stakes races, I should say, from that past week at Gulfstream Park, including an allowance race on Thursday and Sunday. Some horses that were familiar names from last year. Move on to Oaklawn and Aqueduct to wrap things up. A couple of notable stakes races for older horses that produced some nice speed figures. But that'll be at the end of the podcast. A lot of action to talk about before we get to that. And Craig, as I said, we'll begin with that three-year-old action, and we'll start by discussing the Florida Derby and the Arkansas Derby together. As for Fierceness's performance at Gulfstream on Saturday, I mean, I think a lot of people were expecting him to return to form, but hard to expect him to win in the manner that he did, just given how unreliable this horse has been at times. Obviously, really disappointing when he's turned in some poor efforts, both in the Champagne and the Holy Bull, but both times now he's been able to bounce back from those poor efforts with these explosive victories. We saw it last year in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and I would argue he was quite a bit more impressive even than he was in that two-year-old finale this past Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, when he wins, this is how he wins. So, I mean, it's not a huge surprise to me. I mean, it wasn't the strongest field. We talked about it on the forecast last week, and it just seemed like if he was able to get clear early, he kind of had the field over a barrel, and his rider, John Velasquez, certainly was able to get him out from that outside post. He earned it. The early pace figures were 131 for the quarter and the half, so it's not like he was walking on the lead. And from there, I mean, it was just a procession all the way to the wire, kind of like in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, although he had a little more pressure in that one and was actually tracking. But once he took over, I mean, this horse is something else. I do think we still have some questions to answer about him if he faces adversity, which could certainly happen on the first Saturday in May. Very, very rarely does anybody get the kind of trip that Fierceness had on Saturday. So he'll be the favorite. It's too early for me to form strong opinions, but I'm certainly not ready to hand the Derby to him at this point. The speed figure wound up being a 126 from TimeformUS. This is one my assistant does. I tweeted it could have been anywhere from 123 to 129 or so. And funny enough, he was right in the middle. I would take the number. I would say you could probably add plus or 3 points. It was that tough of a number to make just because it seemed like the track to me was getting faster throughout the day, and he seemed to agree with that opinion.
Yeah, for those that are tuning in to get the scoop, the number is a 126. Craig was getting into a little bit of mischief there on April Fool's Day. No timing error this year in the Florida Derby, unlike last year. I guess it was a pretty believable thing to say since we just had this problem with Forte 12 months ago, but not the case this year with Fierceness. The time is right, and it was an extremely fast race. No surprise that a number is going to turn up fast when a horse wins by over 13 lengths, as Fierceness did. Craig, watching this race, I got the impression that Fierceness was kind of walking on the front end, setting a slow pace. But I mean, this horse just does things so easily. He's got so much natural speed. He gives you the impression that he's going slowly up front, even though the pace, looking at these pace figures, was honest. As you said, it was a moderate pace. Low 130s, which seems like a fast pace when you just quote that number, but when you've got a 127 final time fig, it's a pretty even pace throughout the race. I will say, from a race flow standpoint, there was nobody really running on from the back. It was mostly dominated towards the front end, obviously by Fierceness, but also the horse that was second every step of the way, Catalytic, just ran around in that position with nobody challenging him for that runner-up spot. He's also in the Kentucky Derby field, coming away from this race with 50 qualifying points, and it sounds like Saffie Joseph of the Connections will go on to the Derby with him, even though he's so lightly raced. And even beyond that, Grandmo the First just kind of ran around in third place for much of the way. The big disappointments, obviously, were the fourth and fifth place finishers, Conquest Warrior and Hades, and I guess you could say they were somewhat compromised by the way this race unfolded, where nobody was really making up ground from towards the back of the pack, but maybe they just weren't good enough, Craig, because obviously nobody was beating Fierceness on this day, and the fact of the matter is both Conquest Warrior and Hades had to get a little faster coming into this race, and they just did not. Hades didn't get the best trip. It was never really in a great spot from an inside post position, but that's the danger sometimes at Gulfstream Park, going these two-turn distances on the dirt. You head right into that clubhouse turn, and sometimes you encounter traffic. We'll talk about another race that took place there on Saturday where that was a big issue for a certain horse. But Fierceness out in front, clear of all that trouble. I guess the big question with him is, Craig, can he get that same kind of trip in the Derby?
Yeah, that's going to be the real question. I kind of look at the pace a little differently. Yes, there wasn't a lot of movement. That 131, those pace figures early, they probably aren't particularly fast for Fierceness, but I wonder if they're not really fast for the rest of the field. And it kind of sapped the kick of the horses who were in behind and just couldn't make up any ground. We've talked about speed horses using their speed and sapping closers' kicks. And I almost wonder, when a horse runs away like this, if that's not exactly what happened here.
Well, you could kind of see it with Hades in the early stages. He was having trouble keeping up to what seemed like a moderate pace, but remember, he was the one setting that extremely slow pace in the Holy Bull, and maybe he's not a horse that's a naturally forward runner, and he just kind of wound up forward in some slow-paced races, and it just seemed like he was out of the position that Paco Lopez and the Connections wanted him to be in every step of the way. But when you got a really fast horse like Fierceness, he can put other horses in uncomfortable positions, and I think that's his big advantage. That's not going to happen in the Kentucky Derby because there are a lot of fast horses that typically point for that race. Even horses that aren't typically ridden aggressively get more aggressive rides to get clear of traffic on the first Saturday in May. So we'll see what post he draws and how much other speed is in the race. I think we still have some things to iron out with regard to how that field will ultimately come together. But when he's good, Fierceness is really good. And I think if he puts forth this kind of effort on Derby Day at Churchill Downs, no one's going to beat him. But that's the big outstanding question with Fierceness. Can he put these kinds of efforts back to back? I don't think we yet know that answer. Let's move on to the Arkansas Derby, that other major Kentucky Derby prep race from last weekend at Oaklawn Park. And the winner of this race, of course, will not be in the Kentucky Derby starting gate. Muth crossed the wire first for trainer Bob Baffert, but the 100 Kentucky Derby qualifying points that he would earn will be forfeited, since Bob Baffert's runners are, of course, not eligible to run into the Kentucky Derby for the third consecutive year. So Muth potentially a player in the Preakness. Bob Baffert is not yet said where he's ultimately going to point him, but obviously the Preakness would be a logical next step for a horse that clearly possesses quite a bit of talent. And that Breeders' Cup Juvenile from last season was certainly flattered this first week in April, or this last week in March, with Fierceness and Muth, the top two finishers from that race, winning these final round Kentucky Derby prep races. they probably won't face off now for a little while, since we'll see if Fierceness is able to make a race like the Preakness. He'd probably have to win the Derby for Pletcher to even consider that. But as for Muth, Craig, he's a really nice horse. That San Vicente that he won earlier in the year was clearly just a stepping stone race. They weren't really serious about having him totally geared up to produce a top effort that day, but he proved in the Breeders' Cup last year that he can get these two-turn distances, and I was a little skeptical of him going a mile and an eighth, but he proved me wrong. He's just fine going this far.
Yeah, as right as I was about Fierceness and thinking he had a very good chance to dominate, I was totally wrong about this one. Of the four main contenders, Muth was the one I really didn't want any parts of, and he sure delivered. He ran a very good race, tracking a pretty quick pace set by Long Shot, Time for Truth, pressed by Timberlake in there, and it didn't seem to matter. He was able to shake those two off and open up, turning into the stretch. And once he did, nobody could really get close. I know a horse you liked wound up running second, Just Steel. Really big effort from him, which further showed how wrong I was about this race, as he was another one I didn't like. But he's going to the Kentucky Derby for Wayne Lucas. Muth, I wound up giving a 122 TimeformUS speed figure. Pretty easy day to do at Oaklawn. It was overcast and it was a nice day, but it was just overcast most of the day at Oaklawn. Don't think the track really changed much at all. And it was just a pretty good race. And if Muth was eligible for the Kentucky Derby, he would be one of the favorites.
He certainly would be, but not the case this year. And it does sound like there will be 3 horses from this race moving on to the Kentucky Derby. Clearly not the winner, but the second, third, and fourth place finishers all still under consideration for the Run for the Roses. As you said, Just Steel outran his surprisingly large odds in this race to finish second. And not that I loved him in this race, Craig, but I was making the case on the forecast last week that he is a horse that had just gotten nightmare trips and 2 consecutive starts. And I know that there is this feeling that he's a horse that's not going to ultimately want to go farther. But I think the trips had a lot to do with that perception. He wasn't finishing off his races because he had been 4 to 5 wide around the track twice in a row, including once against a rail bias. And I think we saw here what he could do with a fair trip. He's pretty good. And he had run some big speed figures early in his career. He's obviously got a lot more starts under his belt than most of the other 3-year-olds pointed to Kentucky Derby, but that's just the way that D. Wayne Lucas campaigns his horses, and he's got a ton of seasoning coming into that race. We'll see if a mile and a quarter is really up Just Steel's alley, but he ran really well. He wasn't stopping at the end of this race. He was actually the only one making up ground on Muth in the stretch of this Arkansas Derby, so a good effort by him, a very respectable speed figure, finishing second in this race. I think he got a 119, so he's definitely one that's on the radar moving on to the first Saturday in May. The other 2 likely to end up in the Kentucky Derby starting gate are the 3rd and 4th place finishers, Mystic Dan and Timberlake, the winners of the Southwest and Rebel, respectively. Both a little disappointing in here, Craig. I suppose you could say about Mystic Dan that closers didn't really have their best chance at this Arkansas Derby. Not that the pace was slow. It was actually honest, maybe even a little faster than the pace we saw in the Florida Derby. But there wasn't a whole lot of running going on from the back. And also Mystic Dan got such a perfect trip when he was successful in that Southwest earlier in the year. Timberlake probably the bigger disappointment, because I think a lot of people expected him to take a step forward in this race. And while his speed figure basically stayed the same, moved up a tick, I think we expected more from him.
Yeah, I would definitely say we did. And maybe you could say he was compromised a little bit. I was really surprised how close up he was early, but at the end of the day, I think it was the trip he probably had to have given where he was drawn. And he just came up a little bit lacking. He didn't take that step forward. And to the winner, I want to say Muth. One thing I noticed is we have this day coded in dark blue in TimeformUS. And I mean, I didn't see anything watching the races. Maybe it was just circumstances. But on a 13 race card, not a single horse went wire to wire on dirt, which is pretty rare thing. And I think the ones that were closest up was Muth. He was the only one who even came close to that. So it wasn't like it was a speed favoring track or anything like that. So I think it was a good effort by him. As for the others, Mystic Dan, Yeah, he was wide around both turns. I'm sure that cost him a bit, but we had talked about his race in the, I believe it was the Southwest, where he got a dream trip. He didn't get that trip this time, and he wasn't able to get the job done. And with a running style like his, if he shows up in Kentucky, he's probably not going to get that trip again. He's going to lose ground just because of how he runs, and he'll have to take a pretty big step forward.
Yeah, I didn't think there was any bias at Oaklawn Park on Saturday. I get it that there were no gate to wire winners, and everyone on these big racing days is looking for a speed bias or some kind of trend. But watching these races, I didn't see any edge being given to horses. I thought it was a very fair racetrack, and horses could come from off the pace. Speed did not have an advantage, which I think sometimes is what you would expect to see on these big days like this, especially if the track is playing a little quick. I thought everybody had a fair chance this day. And when you look through the card, there are plenty of dirt races that have red color-coded pace figures. So those are races that you would expect to come apart a little bit. I didn't see results that were so aberrational that you would explain it via a track bias, but I suppose it is something you want to keep an eye on because it is a little unusual to have a 13 race card with no horses leading from gate to wire.
Yeah, the one thing I noticed being there in person, I made this comment to a friend of mine, was they race at Oaklawn Park. At least they did on this day. I mean, there was no one getting easy leads. When you went out, you had to earn it. And like you said, there were a lot of fast fractions. There were a lot of honest fractions. I don't think there's any blue fractions on the card. So big fields, dirt racing, and a lot of money tends to bring out the aggressiveness.
Well, let's talk about some of the 3-year-old action from Gulfstream and Oaklawn for the females as they move on to the Kentucky Oaks. Let's begin with the Gulfstream Park Oaks on that Florida Derby undercard. This was race 11 on Saturday, 1.16 miles distance, and the start of this 1.16 miles trip at Gulfstream, Craig, it always gives me a headache. I mean, I hate that they run graded stakes going this far. I've said it before. It's just a chaotic start. There's always a horse or two that gets in serious trouble, arguably in dangerous situations moving into that clubhouse turn. I wish they would just run these races at 1 1/8 miles, but obviously the connections don't want to run 1 1/8 miles or they would do it. That aside, unfortunately, the victim of that trouble in this race was the heavy favorite, Ways and Means. I think there's a fair argument that she was the best horse in this race, Craig, but you could say that and also make the point that the winner, Power Squeeze, as we alluded to on the forecast last week, was just a crazy overlay at 11-1, given the speed figure she had run 2 back over this course, coming in with good form, and the fact that she figured to get the right trip in this race, and she did. Save ground every step of the way and was able to wear down the winner, the runner-up, Ways and Means, who admittedly was unlucky.
Yeah, I would say she was the best horse. This was a race I made my bets, and I'm sure you did as well. And I didn't get to watch the race because I was heading downstairs at Oaklawn. And when I finally remembered to turn it on, I saw Power Squeeze standing in the winner's circle. And I was very happy with myself. And then later I watched the race and was like, yeah, I probably got lucky there. At least a little lucky. But when you're betting 11-1 shots, you probably need a little luck to beat a 2-5 because Ways and Means was very good. She had a lot of obstacles. It was her first time around 2 turns coming off a layoff. And she ran great, but unfortunately for her, the trip just didn't work out. I assume she got enough points to make it to the Kentucky Oaks. I haven't checked that, but I would think a second place finish in one of these 100-point preps, maybe it'll do it. I don't know, but she's certainly deserving if she goes there. Power Squeeze ran a 1:11 TimeformUS speed figure, which is very competitive for this crop, would make her a player as well. She's one who should certainly appreciate the 1 1/8 miles, should get plenty of pace. And Ways and Means actually got a slightly bigger figure, 1:12. And who knows how big it could have been if she had had a clean trip.
Yeah, I mean, as for Ways and Means, she was off a step slowly, which, I mean, wasn't a terrible start, but I think when you're going that distance, if you give anybody an edge moving right into that clubhouse turn, they're going to cut over on you. And that's exactly what Into Champagne did right to her outside. And she was turned a little sideways, had to check, got keen behind horses after that, had to be angled out by Irad. And then when he got her into the clear, I mean, he sensed that the pace was not that fast up front. I mean, I think in retrospect, it maybe was a little faster than he was feeling it was underneath of him, probably because Ways and Means is just such a naturally fast best horse, she can go those honest fractions without being asked too much. But from there, he elected to make this wide, premature move into the race. And it is the short stretch run at Gulfstream, so you want to be in position. But I think he pressed the button maybe a little sooner than he really had to. And he hit the front at the top of the stretch and just didn't quite have enough to hold off Power Squeeze, who, as we said last week, was the one horse in the race that you knew was going to get this distance and be finishing strongly. And she was. But Ways and Means battled on really gamely to put nearly 6 lengths between herself and the rest of the field. We've talked about how this 3-year-old filly crop has not been producing particularly fast speed figures moving on to the Kentucky Oaks. Not so for this race. The 111 for the winner and the 112 that was earned by Ways and Means. Those are among the best numbers that we've seen on the Kentucky Oaks trail so far. Craig, though, it's not clear that Ways and Means is going to have enough points. Unfortunately, 14 horse limit for the Kentucky Oaks. And even though they've tweaked the point structure from last year, which I think was the right thing to do by Churchill Downs, where previously they were awarding 40 points to second place finishers in these final round preps. This year they've upped it to 50 points for second place. But even with that, it's not clear that it's enough because she's only competing in one prep race. And there are horses, we'll talk about a few in the fantasy next, that competed in multiple prep races. And even though they lost, finishes second and third in these 100 round, 100 point prep to the winner, 100 point to the winner prep races, competing in multiple prep races and just racking up those points along the way, they're going to put them above Ways and Means in the ranking. And currently she's 11th on the list, but there are 2 more prep races to be run this weekend, the Ashland and the Gazelle. Maybe some horses who already have points might earn those in the Ashland, but there are certainly horses like Just FYI and Impel who could leapfrog her in that race. If they're probably the top 2 choices in the Ashland. And then the Gazelle has a bunch of horses that I think don't have the points yet, so they could all move above Ways and Means. So there's a real possibility this horse is going to be on the outside looking in, maybe in 15th or 16th on the list, moving on to the Kentucky Oaks. And we'll see if all of those above her go to the race and actually are confirmed. But feels like Ways and Means might be the Kentucky Oaks favorite if she ends up in the starting gate. It would just be unfortunate if she were excluded, but that's kind of the way the points race works, Craig. You can't put all your eggs in one basket and expect to get there if you don't win.
Yeah, and I'm okay with that. I like rewarding horses that actually race. And we're probably going to, after I said that about her getting in, it dawned on me, wait, there's not 20 horses in this field. So I figured she might have some trouble. Who knows? It's still, a month away. There's sure to be at least a few defections. But like you said, she'll probably get passed by enough horses to knock her outside looking in, at least initially. So I hope she gets in because I think she's really talented. But if not, that's the way it goes, like you said, when you only run in one prep race.
Yeah, she's extremely talented. Maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing if she wound up in a race like the 8 Bells, because, running her in the Kentucky Oaks off one prep race, especially one where she had as rough a trip as she did, it's asking a lot of this horse, and I think they're asking a lot of her because she's so talented. And we saw that on Saturday, but I think she still has some obstacles to overcome to even make it to the starting gate on that first Friday in May. The other Oaks prep from this past weekend run at Oaklawn Park on that Arkansas Derby undercard, of course, was the Grade 2 Fantasy. I was just alluding to it. And I think we saw another horse that's going to take quite a bit of money in the Kentucky Oaks. And the winner of this race, Torpedo Anna, another one, kind of like Ways and Means, who was a very talented 2-year-old, had gone to the sidelines after a somewhat disappointing performance in the Goldenrod, but came back off the layoff, just one prep race for the Oaks here. And it turns out that was all she needed because she was ready to fire off this break for Ken McPeak. Breaking from the outside post position didn't matter to her, got into good position and just dominated this field through the lane.
Yeah, she was the horse that disappointed in the Goldenrod at short odds. I had laid off, and she actually, to me, she looked good coming into this race. The big question for me was her post position, and she had good enough tactical speed that it was pretty irrelevant. They went quick up front, spread the field out a little bit. Recharge opened up a little bit, and that kind of gave her a seam to get in and not be hung out too wide around the turn. And you could just see going down the backstretch that she was moving better than everybody else. And it continued that way all the way to the wire as she just made her move and just kept putting space between her and everybody else. Really impressive performance. Wound up with a 111 TimeformUS speed figure, same as the Gulfstream Park Oaks. And I think we have another very strong Kentucky Oaks contender here.
Yeah, I had wondered how far she'd really want to go based on her races from last year, where she was finishing so strongly in her one-turn races. But I think the right way to look at her races as a 2-year-old in retrospect is that Ken McPeak just ran her a little too much. I mean, he ran her 3 times in the span of a month, and the goldenrod probably just asking a little bit too much at that point. Gave her time off, and coming back off the layout, she clearly had no trouble handling the mile in a 16th here, and covered ground every step of the way. But she finished up so powerfully and is geared down through the wire. I mean, she clearly was superior to this group. We're going to have multiple horses coming out of this race landing at the Kentucky Oaks starting gate in all likelihood. As I was saying, runner-up West Omaha and third place Tappan Alley, they both have the points. I mean, they placed at multiple stakes along this path to the Oaks, and they are above Ways and Means on the points list. So they have preference to get in the race, and it sounds like their connections are going to want to go. So we're going to have multiple horses from this fantasy in that Oaks starting gate. I think the big question with the winner, Torpedo Anna, Craig, is not so much what happened during the race, but before the start. She delayed the start of this race, not wanting to go into the gate. She was green and acting up a little bit, maybe causing some issues for those that had to wait in the starting gate for so long, including the number one, My Main Squeeze, who was just standing in the gate for a number of minutes before they actually sprung the latch. That's not something you want to see for a horse that has to face the huge crowd of Kentucky Oaks Friday. But still, she clearly has a lot of talent when she's able to deliver in the afternoon.
Yeah, My Main Squeeze was actually pretty unruly in the gate too. I was actually right there watching. She was causing her own issues, and it probably affected her race. So maybe you want to give her a pass. The only other horse I wanted to mention, and she wasn't really a contender, we're not going to see her in the Oaks, is All Things Go, who wound up running fourth. I think she is a real filly with talent. She's worth watching going forward. She went wire to wire in a surprising maiden score, and I've watched her replay a couple times, and she's definitely one I want to keep an eye on.
Yeah, she missed the break here, which is why she was not contesting the pace as we expected, but still ran well to be fourth, considering that she was encountering a different sort of race scenario than she encountered on debut. So yeah, I agree. She's clearly a horse that has a lot of talent, and she'd be a good candidate for a race like the 8 Bells if they decide to go there. Probably a good thing that she didn't qualify for the Kentucky Oaks, because that'd be asking a lot of a horse like her. One more race to talk about from the 3-year-olds in terms of offering Derby and Oaks points from last week, and that is the Grade 2 UAE Derby on the Dubai World Cup undercard at Meydan in Dubai. And Craig, a horse that won this race in Forever Young that probably is going to attract a lot of support in the Kentucky Derby. It's been confirmed that's where his connections are going to be going next. Undefeated in 5 starts, and I think you can fairly question the quality of what he was beating, particularly in this UAE Derby on Saturday, because it didn't look like much of a field going in. And I think based on the time of this race and how Forever Young won, it is fair to question what was crossing the wire after him. But this is a horse that has done everything right so far. He's got the right kind of running style, which I think is something that you could have critiqued prior UAE Derby winners that received a lot of hype coming into the Kentucky Derby on. Horses like Mendelssohn and Dermosodagake, they had scored these gate-to-wire victories in Dubai where they were very much with the flow or with the profile of that Meydan racetrack, where it seems like you get a big advantage if you get out of the kickback and are able to stay in front and towards the rail every step of the way. Not so for Forever Young. He had to cover ground in this race and won it nicely, like 1.25 miles is right up his alley. I'll be interested to see how he stacks up against these US-based 3-year-olds.
Yeah, I will as well. I don't have a speed figure for this. I have the Timeform rating, which came back as a 114 plus. The plus meaning they think this horse might be better, oftentimes significantly better than what his rating shows. And it's probably hard to argue with that watching the race. I mean, he was wide around both turns and still kept coming. He doesn't have that electrifying turn of foot, but I don't think that's necessarily important in a race like the Kentucky Derby, because he just keeps clicking off those good fractions and finishing strong. I mean, maybe he's a horse that's more suited to a race like the Belmont, but the Belmont's not going to be the target of these Japanese horses at this point. So we're going to see him in the Kentucky Derby. It's when I've done Dubai speed figures in the past, and maybe next week after all the big preps are done, I'll give it a shot. But it's just getting a little tougher to have confidence simply because for the most part, the American horses aren't doing as well as they used to and it used to give me a much better baseline for making the numbers.
Yeah, and I think most people are interested in the pace figures, where this horse is going to be situated early in the Kentucky Derby. I think that was a big question for horses coming out of UAE Derbies past, where it seemed like horses like Mendelssohn and Dermisotogake needed to be forward to have their best chance after earning these front-running victories in Dubai. I don't think that's as big an issue for Forever Young. We've seen him use different kinds of running styles in his races. If you watch his races in Japan, he's come from mid-pack. He's rated in kickback behind horses. He's gotten stalking trips on occasion. I think people got the wrong impression of him when they watched the Saudi Derby. That was a race that was just run over a one-turn mile, and he sort of came off the bridle early and had to be hard ridden to chase that quicker pace. He is a horse that when you watch his Japanese races, then we saw the same thing in this UAE Derby. If the pace is on the moderate side, he travels very comfortably anywhere you place him. Kickback doesn't seem to be a big issue for him, even though I know the connections were a little concerned with the way he handled kickback in Saudi Arabia. And that's why they added that, I don't know what to call it. He was wearing a piece of fabric over his face here. I think that was because of kickback. It was not blinkers. There was no cup on those or earmuffs. He was just wearing fabric over his face. I like watching the run around the far turn. Everybody came off the bridle before this horse, and that just speaks to a horse that has real stamina. And I don't think the distance is going to be a concern for him. We'll see how he handles that 20 horse stampede, but it just seems like he has better attributes to overcome that than horses like Lonnie, Mendelssohn, Dermisotogake. So we'll see if that's the case. But I think it's legitimate that this horse is attracting the kind of hype that he is. I guess the big reservation that you have to have now is that the Derby seemingly got a lot tougher after some US-based 3-year-olds earned some real speed figures this past week, whereas a couple of weeks ago, it looked like Forever Young was not going to have to beat much in the Derby. Maybe that's not the case now, but he definitely adds some intrigue to the field.
Oh, for sure. And I'll transition a little bit to the World Cup. As first, I want to mention the runner-up won't be coming because he was one of those Southern Hemisphere 4-year-olds, so he's not eligible. Autobahn. As far as figures go, I mean, I did take a look at the times of this in the World Cup, which we'll talk about next. I would say this race is about 18 points slower. Laurel River, who we'll talk about, who just absolutely romped in the Dubai World Cup, wound up with a 129 time form rating. So not too far off the gap of Forever Young. 15 points on time form, on speed figures, about an 18-point difference. So I do think there is some reason to think, maybe he does need to get a little bit faster. But watching that race, as you kind of noted, I don't think it's out of the question that he can and will do better in the Derby.
Yeah, and obviously the time, as you said, compared unfavorably to the World Cup, unlike last year with Dermisotogake, where the opposite was true. However, this World Cup, Craig, won by Laurel River. I don't know what to make of this performance. If you ever do make speed figures for this day, I'd love to know what your estimates turn out to be, because it felt like this horse put forth a Flightline-like performance to win. I mean, I don't know what else to call it. I mean, the way he just opened up on this field around the far turn and maintained that advantage through the stretch. I know this horse had talent when he was in the barn to Bob Baffert, and we kind of just started to see it in 2022 when he was putting things together. And then I think he was one of those late scratches from the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile and that swath of vet scratches in 2022 at the Breeders' Cup. And then we didn't see him for a long time and clearly went over to Dubai to a different trainer and been cycling up to a better effort this winter. But I'm not quite sure what to say about this performance, Craig. It was otherworldly. I don't know if we'll ever see it again from this horse. I don't even know if we'll ever see this horse run again, because they're already talking about skipping the rest of the year with him. So I'm just not sure what to make of this Dubai World Cup.
Yeah, I believe he was scratched from the 2023 Breeders' Cup, if I remember as well, as one of the favorites in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. Not sure what was going on there, but he certainly looked healthy on Saturday as he just demolished a really good field. We had some nice Japanese shippers in here, Dermisotogake, Ushba Tesoro, horses that we know are very good. And it just didn't matter. And it's not like all the dirt races on this card were one on the lead. Sometimes you could just say, oh, that's Meydan. Horses get to the front and the race is over. That wasn't the case on Saturday, but it was in this race. Really impressive number. And yeah, he's part of the reason I do want to try to make numbers and see what I can come up with. And maybe I can. It's not like we haven't seen some of these horses in the US and have figures for them. Senor Buscador certainly ran well in here, as he always does, shows up, gave his best effort, just wasn't quite good enough on this day. But there is some data to go on. I don't know what the plans are for Laurel River, but I would certainly hope we see him again in the States, because that was something.
Yeah, I know kind of the years blend together, but we didn't see him at all in 2023. I mean, it was actually a different Dubai-based horse that was scratched in the 2023 Dirt
right.
Mile.
Yep.
That was Algiers, who had been second in the World Cup that year. But yeah, I mean, it kind of feels like we had seen him more recently, but it'd been a year and a half since Laurel River had been on the racetrack in the U.S., and obviously he's still with Judd and they just decided he'd be better suited to a Middle East campaign. Marcus Hirsch's wrap up on the Dubai World Cup reporting that the connections are already saying that there are no plans to send him to the U.S. They're going to point to the World Cup next year, maybe the Saudi Cup first, and they'll probably just not run him until then. I don't know why. I mean, maybe he's a horse that can't stand up to racing, and I guess the long layoff coming into this campaign would seem to suggest that. But I mean, when your horse runs like this, you want to see him take on the top competition again. I guess we'll have to wait a while to see it, but I don't know what to make of it. I mean, it's hard to watch all of the dirt races at Meydan last Saturday and say there was a big track bias when you just watch the Shaheen and this race, the two races won by the local Dubai horses. Two's the winner of the Shaheen, who I hate to use this word, but I mean, he really did re-break in mid-stretch to open up on that field after seeming to come under pressure around the far turn, and made some good U.S.-based horses just look embarrassing in defeat. He rode the rail every step of the way. Laurel River did as well. Not that I think that the rail was a huge advantage, but I think it's always worth noting at that Meydan track where staying out of the kickback and being towards the inside is consistently an advantage there. I don't know what to make of it, but clearly this was a huge performance. I would love to know what the speed figure actually would be for this race, since it did seem really fast. But in terms of the grand scheme of things, major races in the U.S., it might not really matter. So we'll see what they ultimately do with this horse. Let's wrap up Gulfstream, and we're going to talk about a bunch of the races on that Florida Derby undercard, and we'll try to run through them relatively quickly. The Grade 3 Ghost Sapper was the race run for older horses over a dirt route distance. I think this race used to be a mile and an eighth. I think they shortened it to a mile and a 16th this year. Won by Il Miracolo, Craig, who finally got back to the winner's circle. Big day for John Velasquez, who gave a number of good rides. I mean, even outside of Fierceness, it was a walk in the park, coming through on the inside of Tumbarumba to win this race. And it's not hard to, I should say, it's very hard to beat Tumbarumba in a photo finish.
It is, and the speed figures kind of show that this was a very close race. The top two both got 118s. Steel Sunshine a 116. The race got the P notation because the pace was really slow early. Didn't even hit the triple-digit mark through the first half mile, and then the race picked up from there. And given the position the top two were in, it was always going to be really hard to run them down. Miracolo just refused to give up. He fought through on the inside, finally got back to the winner's circle. So really good effort from him. Tumbarumba, he's tough. He's always there at the finish, but it's hard to argue he should have won this race. It just seems like Il Miracolo was a better horse on the day. Don't know why I'm struggling with that today.
Well, we'll move on to the next race. We don't have to say it again. I think Smoke and Tea is a little bit easier to roll off the tongue, and he was the winner of the Appleton under another Excellent ride by Johnny V. I mean, you don't often see John Velasquez delivering these kinds of rides at this point in his career, Craig, where he's slicing through between horses and there are like 6 horses across the track of the stretch. But that was the case in this Appleton. And there were others that were more unlucky, and we'll get to them in a little bit, but not the case for Smoke and Tea, who was able to get a 2-wide trip coming into the lane, searched for room, but John Velasquez found that seam at the 8th pole and was able to burst on through for the victory.
Yeah, that was some finish. Watching at Oaklawn Park, it was really hard for me to tell who won. I actually thought Saratoga Flash had it for a second, but Pete Ayala was all over it. He called the winner, and just a really tight finish. There was a ton of traffic. Some horses not really running straight through the lane caused some other horses to get bottled up. I don't know for a fact that Smoke and Tea was the best horse in the race, but he certainly was the one that got the cleanest trip.
Yeah, he was. And I think the most unlucky horse was Ice Chocolat, who was the favorite in this race, and a horse who has now been unlucky a couple times in a row, more so this time, though, because Paco Lopez, he was trying to do the right thing by saving ground, but then he got into that position where he's saved ground to the point that he's now behind a wall of horses, and rather than stay inside, as Saratoga Flash did to come up the rail, horses drifted off the rail, but Paco also drifted off to try to find that split between horses. Smoke and Tea got to it. Ice Chocolat was unable to find one. He was just got totally buried in traffic through the stretch and never got to deliver his closing run. Anybody else in this race you want to talk about, Craig? I mean, I think one surprising ride was that of the runner-up, Saratoga Flash, because I think he was a horse that most people expected to be pushing the pace or potentially setting the pace in this race. And the connections must have decided beforehand to take him back, because Edgard Zayas showed no aggression and just took him towards the back of the pack, rode the rail, and he closed well to get up for second, but just an unusual trip for him.
Yeah, it definitely was a surprise. It wasn't like it was a super fast pace or anything. It was definitely on the moderate side. The one thing I would say is I think this race it was just a listed stakes. I think it was probably stronger than that. And it's one I'm going to be keeping an eye on, because I think we're going to see horses run better in better competition as they go forward.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, the 3rd and 4th place finishers, Tidal Force and Quality G, more allowance optional claiming horses. Tidal Forces, I don't even think we talked about them on the forecast, even off at 60-1. So it's tough to gauge how strong these races are when they're blanket finishes and it's 6 or 7 horses separated by a length at the wire. Smoke and Tea is definitely a grade 2, grade 3 level horse. We'll see if he can improve again out of this race, because he got the trip. We'll see if it works out again for him against tougher competition. Another stakes on the turf from that Florida Derby undercard was the Grade 2 Pan American, run early in the day. This one going the marathon distance of 1.5 miles, won by Cortez, coming in first off a layoff and first time in this country for Christophe Clement. This was a former Andre Fabre trainee who is now a 6-year-old gelding making his U.S. debut. And a good effort, Craig, though I don't think he was beating a field that was exactly living up to the grade 2 rating of this race.
No, this is one that's the opposite. I would say it was overgraded. Tawny Port was 3 to 5 in here. Don't get me wrong, he's fine, but he's probably more a listed grade 3 type horse at best, and just not the strongest field, but a good debut in North America for Cortez, and I would imagine he'll try tougher going forward. His speed figure, I forgot to mention, a 121. It was fine. The top 3 all got that figure. They were bunched up on the wire, so not really sure how strong this particular race was.
Yeah, and Tawny Port probably a little bit unlucky. I think there was a bit of a difference in trips between he and his stablemate winner, Cortez. Joel Rosario got that one to the outside to get first run coming to the top of the stretch. Irad Ortiz elected to stay behind horses in traffic, got through a little bit too late. Arguably, the results might have been reversed if Tawny Port had gotten first run, but that's the risk you take sometimes at Gulfstream. The stretch is so short, and it's so difficult to make up ground on the turf at Gulfstream that I think if you get stopped at any point, you're really going to be up against it from getting to the wire first. Another stakes event on the turf, going a marathon distance on Saturday, was the Grade 3 Orchid. This one for the fillies and mares, and a nice horse making her return to the races here in McCulloch. She had shown ability both during her 3-year-old and 4-year-old seasons last year, achieving her big upset over Warlike Goddess at Saratoga last year, and had finished off the year, in decent fashion. Obviously, not showing up against Tougher in the Breeders' Cup, came off the layoff here and got her campaign off to a nice start.
Yeah, it was a good effort. I would hope this is just the start of something. She only ran a 118 TimeformUS speed figure. I would say she got a pretty good trip. All the fractions are coded in red for this race. Bit of not really a speed duel, but the top two in front of her were going pretty quick. They were both long shots. They both kind of backed out of it. And it just came down to a battle between the closers. The 2-3 finishers kind of had some stuff going on between them and may have hindered them a little bit. But McCulloch ran fine. The 118 speed figure, I think she has better in her going forward. But like I said, I think this was just a start to her campaign.
Yeah, I thought surprisingly ran well in her first attempt going a marathon distance. Arguably, if Jose Ortiz had gotten her outside a little bit sooner, she would have had a chance to catch McCulloch because she had to wait in traffic the longest of those top 3 finishers. But she finished up well, was crossing the wire with the most energy of anybody. So as we talked about in the forecast, she's one who definitely had the pedigree to go this longer distance. And I wouldn't be surprised if Todd Pletcher decides to concentrate on these marathon races moving forward. La Mahana ran fine, just probably needed her first start in the U.S. And given the stamina that she had showed overseas, I wonder if she's the kind of horse that Christophe Clement might circle a race like the Belmont Gold Cup on that Belmont Stakes weekend going at 2 miles. I wonder if they're still running at 2 miles at Saratoga. I'll have to look that up. I'm just kind of assuming, but that's usually a race that would suit a horse like her.
Yeah, she was a little bit slow, as we kind of noted when you watched her replays. She's one, I mean, Gulfstream was never really going to suit her, so I might give her another chance at a 1.5 miles at her second start over a different course, depending where she shows up.
Earlier in the day, they ran the Cutler Bay for the 3-year-olds. This one was won by Set, a horse that I think we had talked about on the podcast when he made his debut. Had gotten a big speed figure that day, had been very impressive in victory, drawing off by open lengths. Faced Stakes Company here, probably not the strongest group of 3-year-old stakes horses you're going to see assembled at Gulfstream during the winter-spring meet, but got the job done here at a very short price and seems like one that has quite a bit of talent. He's going to get a test down the line, though, both in terms of field quality and facing a tougher pace scenario.
Yeah, he did what he had to do. He had run a 108 in his debut at the same exact distance on this day. He got a 106. I personally would prefer to see a step forward, but I mean, when you watch the race, he won easy. It was never really in doubt. He was right up there, just sitting right off the pace and had plenty left turning for home. So no knocks. I would have preferred to see him take a jump up.
He won going 7.5 furlongs both times. Watching this horse run, I had some questions about how far he wants to go. He seems like more of a 7 furlong to a mile kind of horse to me. And that's the way the connections have been campaigning him so far. He is a New York bred. If they ever want to run him in New York, there are plenty of lucrative stakes races for him there, going shorter distances. Obviously, Belmont Park not being open this year, the 7 furlong turf races are sort of out, though he is trained by Mark Cassidy, so I guess we could eventually see him at Woodbine. They do run 7 furlongs on the turf there. So nice horse in Set, but he'll face tougher down the line. A 3-year-old that really turned some heads early in this Gulfstream Park card on Saturday was the winner of race 4, maiden special weight event. That was Mindframe. And actually, this was race 5 on the card. Near 14 length debut winner, going out for the same connections as Fierceness, Todd Pletcher, and Rapoli Stable. I believe this one also owned by St. Elias Stable. And the kind of debut that really gets you excited, Craig, because this horse was not just some speed freak. I mean, he raided off some fast horses in the early stages, sat about 3 to 4 lengths off the pace, just looped those horses coming to the quarter pole. And the way he drew off through the stretch, coming home very fast, I mean, really gives you some confidence that added ground might be up this horse's alley down the line. And that's a scary thought because he already ran very well in this sprint debut effort.
Yeah, that was something. It was one I was watching it live while at Oaklawn and Wow, it was quite the eye-catching performance. He wound up with a 121 Timeform US speed figure. My assistant actually used the breakout notation, and the breakout is it was more conservative. He used a faster track variant than he did for the next couple of dirt races. It's always a little tricky at Gulfstream. It's never really easy to make speed figures, particularly when horses run off and win by this much in a race with a lot of lately raced horses. There's multiple turf races in between the dirt races. In this case, I think this was the first dirt race of the day. Then it was followed by a turf race. And so maybe you want to take the speed figure with a grain of salt, but it was obviously a very, very good performance. And if he had sent back our worksheet and it had been a 126 like Fierceness ran, I really couldn't have argued with it, but he took a little more conservative route. And this is a horse I'm excited to see come back.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to make this a fast race. How fast, I think, is open to debate, given that it did seem like the track had to change. I mean, if you group this with the other 7 furlong race on the card, Craig, the Sir Shackleton, that we're not going to talk about, I mean, this speed figure would be through the roof. Obviously, you have to knock it down a little bit because every horse in the race that had prior experience would be running a career best number by like 20, 30 points. You can't have that be, that would obviously be an issue. But when a horse wins by nearly 14 lengths by Mindframe did, pretty confident it was a fast number. And the 121 makes sense to me. Interested to see where this horse goes now. Obviously, there are some major 3-year-old races that are just on the horizon. We've seen that these connections are not afraid to throw a horse into stakes company in its second start. Mike Rapoli's running some maidens in these Derby preps along the way. But clearly the Derby's off the table, but I mean, the Belmont Stakes in June, I mean, could he get in another race between now and then if they try stakes company, or they take a more patient approach with him? I wonder what they're going to do, but he certainly gave off the vibe, did this Son of Constitution, that 2 turns would be within his scope based on the way he finished this race, just the way he physically moves on the track. He looks like he's got some size and scope to him. So an exciting horse, to say the least. Another horse that looked pretty exciting this past week at Gulfstream was Thursday allowance winner Knightsbridge, a horse that I know had attracted some early support in those first few Kentucky Derby future wagers after his impressive debut victory at Churchill Downs towards the end of his 2-year-old season. Went to the sidelines, had setbacks, missed some time earlier this year, but looks like Bill Mott finally has him going back in the right direction as he made his return to the races on Thursday and did what he was supposed to do against an overmatched group of allowance rivals.
Yeah, he's now won 2 races by 19.5 lengths total. Not really much you can knock with a horse like this. There wasn't much competition in this one. He was 1-9, but he ran a 117 Timeform US speed figure. It was the only 2-turn race on the day, which made it a little bit difficult, but they run enough 2-turn races. I think we have a decent handle on those. So I think the number's legit, and I'm not sure where this one's going to show up, but he obviously has some real talent, and I look forward to seeing him go 2 turns. Doesn't seem like that should be any issue at all for him.
Yeah, the Craig, this is the only dirt race of the day. It was one of those days where Gulfstream ran just one dirt race, not a favor to speed figure makers. But even in these situations, I mean, you can look at the other horses in the race and come up with a pretty good estimate for what the speed figure is going to be. Isn't that right?
Yes, you're correct. I'm actually the one who made this figure. I did Gulfstream on the day, and I should have remembered it was the only dirt race. But yeah, there were 5 horses. 3 of them had been running on synth and turf for the most part, so not the easiest figure in the world. But I mean, he won by 9 lengths. The number I came up with kind of lines up for all the other horses, so it's one we'll keep an eye on. But I'm not sure what else you could do with it. I also have to check. I don't know why we have a pink color-coded rating on there if there was only 1 dirt race. That shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, I think we'd have to check that there is a minimum race limit that's triggering those. Sometimes we have to maintain that code to make sure it's firing properly. But yeah, good catch on your part, Craig. This is the younger half brother to Speaker's Corner, who was that brilliant winner of the Carter prior year. I think that was 2 years ago. A horse that was a really talented miler. We'll see how far Knightsbridge ultimately wants to go. He is by Nyquist. I think Speaker's Corner was by Street Sense. So, I mean, similar influences with regard to distance. They're talking about the Pat Day Mile as a possibility, and that seems like the right kind of stepping stone for a horse that has shown this kind of talent. On Sunday, we saw the return of Far Bridge, the winner of the Grade 1 Belmont Derby during his 3-year-old season last year, coming back as a 4-year-old and switching back into the barn of Christophe Clement. This was a horse who, of course, was privately purchased for a large sum of money and was in that purchase transferred away from Christophe to Todd Pletcher. Did some nice things for Todd. I mean, obviously won that Grade 1 Belmont Derby while in Pletcher's barn, but I'm not sure why they took him away from Christophe Clement in the first place. And I guess had a couple of disappointing efforts towards the end of last year. And now he's back with his original trainer.
Yeah, he showed up and did exactly what he was supposed to do, which was good to see. He's a horse who's run well every single time he stepped foot on the track. This wasn't the strongest field you're ever going to see, but I liked how he did it. It was a race with very little pace in it, and he was able to just save ground in behind. Jose Ortiz never seemed to be too worried about it and had that well-timed move late to get up against a lone leader who I would say wasn't stopping in one night standards. He was actually really digging in, and Far Bridge just had a little too much for him late.
Yeah, I like the way he finished off this race. Got a perfect trip, but I mean, you had to like the way he finished up in hand more comfortably than the margin of victory would indicate. And he'll obviously have some bigger targets on his resume a little bit later this year. Well, that wraps up the Gulfstream action. We just got a couple more races to wrap up on this podcast at Oaklawn and Aqueduct. On that Arkansas Derby undercard, another race that got a notable speed figure was the Grade 3 Oaklawn Mile for the older horses. This one won by Frosted Grace, a horse that has flashed some real talent at times, has also dipped into the claiming ranks at times, did that actually in his most recent start at Oaklawn when he won earlier in the meet, I think back in January for Robertino Diodoro. I guess that was the confidence boost that Frosted Grace needed because now he's back in the winner's circle for a graded stakes race.
Yeah, and it was a pretty fast race for him. Like you said, we've seen him run a lot. I mean, this was his 46th career start, and I believe the 122 speed figure he got on this day is a career high in his first start for Mike Maker. Good effort by him, and I mean, there were tons of dirt races on the card. They're all dirt races, but I mean, tons of two-turn races, and it was hard to come up with a lower speed figure for this race. I think it was just a really good effort by him. Silver Prospector ran a really nice race. He tends to run well when he's able to make the lead. This was a Grade 3. I think it's probably about the quality of horse that they are. Wouldn't expect any of these horses to be ripping off Grade 1s anytime soon, but a good solid effort and a really nice purse for Grade 3 horses.
Yeah, I would imagine this horse was fairly late coming into the Mike Maker barn for this race. I don't know the full story, but I would guess that this is a horse that was just transferred to Mike Maker this week since Robertino Diodoro was just suspended by Haiwu. We're not going to get into that right now, but just wanted to make mention of that since I think it's something that people were thinking about when this race was run on Saturday. But yeah, Frosted Grace, it's not like this performance came out of nowhere. He had run well at the graded stakes level in the past, and probably did just get that confidence boost that he needed in his prior start. And also, yeah, nice to see Silver Prospector run well. This was a good race for those old timers. I mean, the top two finishers have been around for a long time, and they were able to get their time in the spotlight this past Saturday. One more race to mention, Craig, that was the Excelsior run at Aqueduct on Saturday. It was a fun card at Aqueduct. Plenty of starter allowance races for horses that have been competing in the claiming ranks all winter long. The only true stakes event was this Excelsior going 1 1/8 miles for a pretty nice group of older horses. And it ended up being a big upset as Laughing Boy was awarded the victory for David Jacobson at 54-1. David Jacobson was winning 5 races on this Aqueduct card, including this victory by a DQ. The horse that crossed the wire first, though, was Messier. And I think this was a decision that was somewhat controversial, as a number of the stewards' decisions have been lately in New York. But you could debate it all day long. Both these horses ran pretty well. I would also say they were kind of with the track profile on Saturday because we saw a lot of speed winning.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I saw it's coated in bright red, and watching this race in particular, it certainly seemed to match that. And it's one when I made the speed figure, uh, I kind of made sure to keep it conservative because I could have given these horses an actual much higher number. It was a pretty big gap back to third. So 122 for the put up winner, who was on the lead early and got some extra credit for the fast pace. Messier as the disqualified horse gets a 121. I don't really have a super strong opinion on the disqualification. Personally, I prefer these kind of results to stay as is. I don't think it was obvious that Laughing Boy was going to win, but I'll just say I've seen worse left up and I've seen less taken down. So not the worst call I've ever seen.
That's kind of the way that I felt about it, Craig. I think that the big question here isn't so much would Laughing Boy have won or not, because I think the stewards are a little swayed, as they probably should be, when a horse gets fouled and then is coming back at the end to try to win the race, and Laughing Boy angled to the back to the outside and was coming back at Messier at the end. I think the stewards are supposed to consider that a little bit. What I would differ with the stewards about was that I'm not sure there was any infraction at all, because I thought when Messier crossed over, he was just barely clear. It's hard to tell, and there's really no camera angle that shows it perfectly. And I think when it's so hard to tell from the replay and it's a little unclear from any angle, you're just supposed to give the benefit of the doubt to the winner and not insert yourself to make a conversation about you as the steward. And perhaps Jose Gomez created a somewhat dangerous situation because it's a game of inches at that point. And I guess there is the possibility Laughing Boy could have clipped heels. But in that situation, when it's unclear if there was an infraction, you're just supposed to leave the horse up and then give Jose Gomez some days. I mean, suspend him and send him a message. But I disagreed with this one a little bit, but like you said, it's a close call. It's not so egregiously wrong. I mean, it's not like that decision back in December where it was clear from the camera angles that nothing really happened, or the horse that was disqualified didn't really do anything and they took him down. So not nearly as bad as that. I know it seems like sometimes horse players have very short-term memories, and everything that just happens is the worst thing that ever happened. Yeah, I would mildly disagree with it, but I'm not going to make a big deal about critiquing the stewards in this case. And that brings us to the end of this week's rundown. Obviously, another big weekend of racing on tap coming up. The opening of Keeneland, which I know everybody looks forward to at this time of year. And the big race there this Saturday will, of course, be that Grade 1 Bluegrass, one of the final 100-point to the winner Derby prep races. Also on Saturday, the Grade 2 Wood Memorial at Aqueduct, and, of course, the Santa Anita Derby out at Santa Anita, though we're not sure if that Santa Anita Derby is really going to have major implications on the Kentucky Derby, since I think Bob Baffert might be starting multiple horses in that race. We'll see how all of that shakes out. As for us, Craig, on the forecast, I think it would make sense to talk about Keeneland on Saturday.
Yeah, whichever is fine with me. I haven't seen the cards, but any of them are good by me. I'm sure Aqueduct will have a good card. I'm sure Keeneland will have a good card as well. So I'm perfectly fine with that.
Yeah, I'll already be writing plenty about Aqueduct for Saturday, as I normally do. So let's give the listeners a bonus and talk about Keeneland. I think that card should come up excellent. We obviously haven't seen it yet, recording this early on Tuesday morning, but we'll look forward to those PPs coming out a little bit later today. So everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.